now I know that I'm now officially live on both Facebook Live and Periscope. I'm going to talk just for a few moments until a few people have joined us. I'm joining you live from Los Angeles, and it's currently 12 o'clock here. I know it's 8 o'clock in the UK. I'm very, very grateful to be here today talking to parents who want to join us about addiction, substance misuse, and any of the issues that parents are interested in around this subject. I'm doing this day today in support of the fantastic new blog that's just launched, Letting the Light In. And this is a wonderful resource for parents that will be growing as it develops. It actually launched last week, and it is a very informative blog that tells the story of one parent's journey through addiction with their young person and also into recovery. If you haven't had a chance to explore that blog, Letting the Light In, please do. It's a fantastic resource, and as I say, it will keep growing. My name is Sarah Graham, and I'm an addiction therapist from the United Kingdom. I have a small business in the UK called Sarah Graham Solutions, and we work with people with the whole range of addictions. We believe that addiction is an illness that affects people physically, mentally, emotionally and spiritually, and so that the best way to treat that is to treat all of the different roots and all of the symptoms of that addiction, and to get to the underlying traumas which often are part of why a person is abusing substances or using addictive behaviours. I'm in recovery myself. I've been in recovery I just celebrated 15 years of sobriety. So I do this work because I've walked this journey as a young person and also as an adult. I didn't get clean until I was 32, although I could have gone to rehab aged 15, looking back, if the resources had been available in the UK. So we have a few people online, both on Periscope and on Facebook Live, I believe. So if anybody has any questions, please do feel free to ask them. As this is the first time I've done a session on both Facebook Live and on Periscope, I am going to be juggling a little bit between the two networks, and if I don't catch all of the questions that come in, I apologise in advance. I also think it's really important to say off the bat that this is not a confidential environment, obviously, as we're on social media. So if you haven't got an account on social media that disguises your identity and you are talking about a specific young person, please be aware of confidentiality issues. If there are any things that you need to talk about that we can't talk about in this forum, then I'm happy to give out my email and to continue this discussion off of this live format. But I'd like to be able to today speak in general terms about addiction. Okay, we have a question coming in. What are the signs of a slide into addiction? Okay, thank you for that question from Penny. One of the things that's quite complicated about working with teenagers specifically is that some of the signs of addiction are also signs that you might see exhibited in a teenager. And so this can be one of the ways that the young person can hide what's going on, and also that parents can reassure themselves, oh, well, this is just a teenager being a teenager. So the things that we are looking for as addiction experts when we work with a young person are the signs of behaviour change. Have we got a young person who is formerly very committed to doing their schooling, who's now suddenly not bothering? We're seeing a slide in grades. Are we seeing mood changes? Are we seeing dramatic mood changes? Is the young person that we raised becoming a person who we don't recognise? Are we starting to see problems with sleep or an excess of sleep? Are we seeing appetite disturbances, either eating too much, and kind of binge eating is a common one with cannabis use, or are we seeing restricting of eating, which is a sign of stimulant drug use? Another big one that parents often pick up first is money, the issue of pocket money, because obviously any illegal substance tends to be priced at a price that can burn through money very quickly. And so you may see that your young person is starting to spend their savings, if they have savings that they've saved up from Christmases, birthdays, Hanukkah, they may start spending the money that they'd been saving previously to buy specific things and not be able to account for where that money's going. A very big warning sign that parents often see, and this is when we've got to a stage when there's a very serious problem developing, is that the young person may actually start stealing money from parents and carers, and that is a real warning sign that something is seriously going wrong if your young person crosses over that boundary and starts stealing from you. And it's really important to pick up on any of these signs that I've just outlined. Yes, of course, some of them, sleep disturbances, mood swings, those are very much hormonal things too. That parents who have got a child who's never used a substance or abused alcohol may see just because of the hormonal changes. But it tends to be kind of more extreme version of those normal changes that you see a teenager go through. And I think one of the things I would want to really stress today is that parents do know their children. If you're coming to this broadcast today, you are a concerned parent, you are a loving parent. You're not a parent who's kind of a distant parent who doesn't know what's going on. And so trust your intuition. Nobody knows your child better than you do. You raise them, so trust your intuition. The child may say things to you, and they may present a very good story, and they may actually get their friends to also back up their story, but you may have a gut instinct that that is not actually the reality of the situation. And if you do a little bit of digging, you may discover that all is not as it seems. One message I want to say very clearly to all parents and carers today is, if you have a suspicion that something is going on, do not just dismiss it. Do not just be placated. It's very important, though, that you take the opportunity to actually start communication with the young person. I have done a question and answer session with the author of the blog Letting the Light In and talk about this. Too often, if you have warning signs, or if you may actually discover that something has happened, maybe a young person has been picked up by school for doing something like being caught behind the bike shed smoking what they think might be cannabis, or maybe smoking a synthetic cannabinoid. Of course, many young people may not have been using the historically illegal drugs, but in the last 10 years we've seen the rise of synthetic drugs, which were formerly called legal highs, although they have now been banned by the Psychoactive Substances Bill, and so they're not legal anymore. So it may be one of these substances that the young person has been caught using. Rather than go straight into punishing mode and straight into kind of authoritarian mode, it's really important to start opening up a dialogue with the young person and try to rebuild trust and establish what's going on. Do we have another question? I see that we've got a couple of people on Periscope. I'm going to be honest with you, I've never used Facebook Live up until today, so I'm not entirely sure whether or how many people we may have on Facebook Live. So I'll just carry on talking if nobody else is asking questions. I can talk for a while. Another issue that's very important is the issue of boundaries, and there are some very good blogs about boundaries on this Letting Light In blog. Boundaries are absolutely vital in tackling substance misuse and addiction, because one of the first things that starts happening when a problem is taking hold is that boundaries start getting pushed, if not broken. And people who do have addictions are arch manipulators. Unfortunately, the addiction is so powerful once it takes hold that it does drive behaviour change, and it does drive personality change in terms of telling lies, becoming manipulative, being prepared to do things that previously you wouldn't do, because you are justifying it to yourself in terms of the need to use. When somebody has an addiction, it's very powerful. And I know that's stating the obvious, but if you're a parent out there and you've ever been addicted to cigarettes, are the most common one, or found, even something simple like chocolate if you really have a sweet tooth and you love chocolate and you try and put it down, you go on a diet and you put it down, you will know how difficult it is to enact behavior change if you have a strong liking for something. Well, that gives you a tiny inkling of what it's like when you become addicted to a substance. When a substance is really meeting the need, whatever that need is, be it giving the young person confidence that they don't feel they have, maybe helping them deal with the trauma of parental divorce, or low self-worth issues, or perhaps bullying, or sometimes sexual abuse may be going on. When I sit and work with young people, it's very rare that I come across a young person who hasn't got something going on in the background, which the substance, be it alcohol or drugs, initially seem to be the answer to. Of course, many young people experiment with drugs and alcohol, and the vast majority of those young people who experiment are not going to go on to develop an addiction. Probably the estimate is that 1 in 10 people who drink regularly will have a dependency on that alcohol as their lives progress, which is a high number. That's not as high as addiction to other substances. I haven't got the facts in front of me right now, but if you're interested, there actually is quite a good evidence base around the likelihood of getting addicted to substances based on their kind of addictive potential. But that is not the whole story. A substance may in itself have a kind of addictive potential. At one time, over 50% of the population were addicted to smoking, when smoking was completely normalised and was seen as a good thing before we realised that the severe health consequences of smoking. That figure's a lot lower, but when you consider that we now know exactly how life-threatening long-term nicotine usage is in cigarette form, and we have all probably lost somebody now to cigarette smoking through lung cancer and the other cancers that cigarette smoking causes, still we have a very high percentage of people who will carry on smoking knowing the risks, and that is purely because of addiction. Obviously, I know some of the things I'm going to be saying today are stating the obvious, but I think it's important to kind of spell things out and make the connections, because another thing that's really worth knowing about addiction is that there is this process called the denial process, and this is a very clever way that the human brain has protected us from the knowledge that there are very dangerous things in the world. And of course, when you were a cave person, the denial process was probably very useful if you'd had an experience being hunted by a saber-toothed tiger or a woolly mammoth and just barely got away with your life. The denial process probably enabled you to go back out and hunt the next day or in a few days' time, and so was useful. That process is not so helpful now, in that it enables a person who is experiencing consequences from substance misuse. Going back to the young person that we were talking about earlier, maybe that young person has already been threatened with suspension, if not expulsion, from school. But the denial process will kick in and will protect the person from the true nature of what's going on. It's kind of like having the blinkers on. Often when young people come and see me for the first time and they kind of tell me their story, they will kind of, maybe in the first session even, tell me lots of different things, but they won't be able to see the connections between the different areas. Maybe there have been a few consequences that have already happened, which is why their parent or parents have pushed them through the door to come and see me, but they won't have been able to join up the dots, because the denial process stops the individual from being able to see the whole picture. It's a bit like if you imagine your attic having lots of different pieces of your history in different suitcases in the attic, and you kind of have a vague sense of what's up there, but you don't really know where everything is. You can't lay your hands on it. Okay. Does anybody else have another question, or shall I just carry on talking? I'm pretty good at carrying on talking. Okay. Oh, great. Can you talk a bit about eating disorders? Specifically, how would you spot an emerging problem? Okay, yes, thank you for raising that. Eating disorders are very important and very much part of the picture, especially for young women, but increasingly for young men. Historically, eating disorders have been one of the ways that young women have dealt with distress and trauma, and now we're increasingly seeing young men developing eating disorders as our society becomes more equal opportunities in terms of putting pressure on young men to conform to certain body types as well. Eating disorders are quite difficult to summarise simply because eating disorders can manifest in lots of different ways. You obviously can see somebody who's restricting food, and that can lead to anorexia, which is very much about control. It's about controlling how much you eat and also controlling your feelings. When you go into that place of complete self-will around food, it can in the early stages feel enormously satisfying to have that control. Often young women especially start acting out with an eating disorder like anorexia at a point in their life when they feel that their body is changing. Maybe they feel that their life is becoming out of control in terms of the pressures and stresses on them. Often young women who have anorexia, and young men, are highly intelligent, and it can make a lot of intellectual sense, the idea that and I don't think this is necessarily a conscious process, but the idea that you may feel out of control in many areas of your life, but there's one thing that you can control, and that's what you put in your mouth. And there's a lot of mental, I think another thing that's important to know about addiction is it's not just the actual kind of relationship with the substance that you're putting into yourself or the thing that you're denying yourself. Because denial, I think we know a lot more in the general population. We know much more about addiction in terms of excess, but there's the flip side of the excess side of addiction is a kind of an anorexia, not just in terms of food, but also in terms of social anorexia, in terms of restricting contact with other people. You probably have heard of sexual addiction. Well, the flip side of sexual addiction is sexual anorexia, which is restricting and controlling. I digress a little bit. The mental side of addiction is very important as well in terms of the mental obsession. We're probably familiar, or you're probably familiar with the compulsivity side of addiction, somebody doing something against their will compulsively. Well, the thing that's going on intellectually, mentally at the same time is a kind of mental obsession with, in this case, food. So somebody who has an eating disorder will likely be very obsessed with food. And specifically with anorexia, you will often meet an individual who knows every single calorie in every single food product that they might experience. They will be able to tell you exactly how many calories are in a Starbucks muffin, exactly how many calories are in an apple, and will have made a decision about what is an acceptable number of calories for them to consume, and they will be incredibly committed to that. Unfortunately, of course, when you are restricting calorie intake, and parents will notice this very quickly because the young person will start losing weight, sometimes dramatically, if the young person suddenly commits to an extreme food program. And of course, when you go through such an extreme process of restricting, you also compromise your body's ability to work properly. You will start to see physical changes very quickly, which can be dangerous, especially in a young person who already is on the thin side. And of course, cognitive functioning gets impaired very quickly. If you haven't got enough glucose in your bloodstream, your ability to think properly and to be able to plan properly, and to be able to just kind of think about things rationally diminishes. And so you can get really trapped into this downward spiral very quickly, where you haven't got enough calories to function properly. And you also can find yourself in this situation where you are not able to clearly see yourself. Body dysmorphia, as we call it, is a very common part of eating disorders. And body dysmorphia is literally where somebody will look in the mirror and not be able to see a clear reflection of what they look like. They will find that they will see themselves as bigger than they actually are. They will look at their body, and to you as a parent or to an outside observer like me as an addiction expert, I will see a young person who is very thin often, certainly thinner than they should be, and with a low BMI index. But they will point out the one bit of their body that they think is too fat, and will be very, very obsessive about that. Treating eating disorders is becoming increasingly complex in the social media age because, and this is incredibly sick, but there are many what are called Anna sites out there on the internet, which basically people who are trapped in eating disorders feeding each other's obsession and compulsion and kind of competing with each other to get thinner and thinner, and hero worshipping those celebrities which are seen as kind of carrying the torch of the eating disorder. That's more about anorexia. Of course, there are other forms of eating disorder such as bulimia nervosa, and which is compulsively overeating and then purging, and maintaining weight through not actually allowing yourself to digest the food that you're eating, and then compulsive overeating. Compulsive overeating is an interesting one because many people find that they have a compulsive relationship with food, and even people who aren't even necessarily morbidly obese but have an unhealthy relationship with food and are eating on their feelings, and find that they get compulsive around eating, especially if they eat certain foods. And I think one of the problems that we have in the Western world and increasingly around the whole world is the industrialization of food and the packaging of food products on the shelf to be on the shelf for a long period of time. Of course, fresh food doesn't need salt and sugar added to it or to be processed very much. But when you live in a society where everybody is very time limited, and everybody wants to have instant meals that they can bung in the microwave, then they're going to reach for the product that is on the shelf. And of course, the food manufacturers have limited options for preserving food. And the two options historically, aside from preservatives, which obviously were challenged, the use of preservatives was challenged in the I think it began in the 70s, but certainly in the 80s into the 90s. And so manufacturers turned instead to salt and sugar. Salt, again, there was so much work done in the media around the potential consequences of too much salt in the diet, so manufacturers really then lent on sugar as their go-to. And processed sugar is something that in the bloodstream and in the brain can really act like a drug for some people. You may have heard of the term sugar sensitivity. People like Davina McCall have been doing a very good job in the United Kingdom raising the subject of sugar sensitivity, and people talking about doing sugar detoxes. The person I trained with, who's the American expert, but also really the global expert on sugar sensitivity, is a lady called Catherine de Maisons, Desmaisons, I think. If you are interested in looking her up, she's got a fantastic website called Radiant Recovery. Just Google Radiant Recovery, and one thing that's great about her website is that she's got a question and answer section and an actual sugar test that you can do. So if you think that you might be sugar sensitive and that you have a tendency to overeat, especially if you've had anything sweet, check out that sugar sensitive website and do the sugar test. This is an important thing as well for bringing this back to teenagers, because many teenagers, the foods that they're attracted to and the foods that are marketed at them are unhealthy fast foods, which have a lot of processed white flour. Processed white flour breaks down into sugar in the bloodstream very quickly, and so triggers sugar sensitivity. And of course, many soda drinks that young people love have a very high sugar content, along with chocolate and confectionery. If somebody is sugar sensitive, it's important to diagnose that, and it's important to recognize that and to get onto a healthy food plan, because it's thought that many people who have an alcohol addiction, actually underlying that alcohol addiction is sugar sensitivity. Of course, alcohol has a lot of sugar in it. So people are addicted to the alcohol component of the drink, but also to the sugar as well. And it's interesting how often when people come into recovery around alcohol addiction, the next addiction that pops up is food addiction, and that's linked to the sugar that they're craving. Okay. Anybody else out there like to ask a question? Did I answer that question sufficiently? I'm aware that in the time that we have, I can't go into things in too great depth. Just checking how we're doing time-wise. Okay. If you haven't had a chance to go to the Letting the Light In website, I thoroughly recommend it. And if you are a professional watching this, thank you. Does addiction tend to run in families? Yes, it absolutely does tend to run in families. There's quite a good evidence base around the fact that there is an addiction gene, and that's not to say that if you are from a family that has addiction in it, that you have a child, that your child will definitely become an addict. It's more complicated than that, as is the case with many issues that genes are a part of. We think that what happens is that trauma is the trigger that turns on the addiction gene. And we also think that it's possible to do what is becoming known as parenting for prevention, which is to offset the addiction gene by raising children in ways that help them communicate about their feelings, and which help them process and understand their feelings. I'm in recovery myself, and I was fortunate in 2009 to have my brain assessed for a tool called neuroengineering, and that tool is a sophisticated way of analysing the brain functioning under stress. They run, I think it's over 300 different tests on the brain functioning, and they can look at and identify certain predispositions in the brain. And genetically, it looks like there are two main drivers that fuel addiction from a sort of brain point of view: a tendency towards depression and a tendency towards compulsivity. Some people have one or the other. Some people, like myself, are double winners and have both the tendency to depression and compulsivity, and that's very much the part that is passed on. I can say categorically to you that when I came into recovery, I would have pointed the finger at lots of different things in my life and said I was an addict because this happened and that happened. And I certainly was like a lot of people in early recovery. I was kind of pointing the finger and blaming people for my addiction and blaming situations for my addiction. But as I've gone forward in my recovery and done more work, and also had the experience of working with many hundreds of young people and adult addicts, I would say that in many cases, yes, certainly the trauma was the thing that that maybe was the kind of fertilizer of the addiction, the kind of fuel for the addiction. But I believe that the first time I put a mood-altering substance into my body, which was alcohol, when I was 12 years old, I started drinking regularly when I was 12 years old, that my response to alcohol was different to many of the other young people that I was experimenting with. For me, it was a much more powerful experience. Because I was depressed and I didn't realise that I was depressed, or I certainly had a tendency towards depression from an early age, and I had low self-worth. Many young people who abuse substances do so because they have low self-worth, and the use of the substance kind of papers that over. You know, when you I mean, everybody knows that alcohol can give you that sort of sense of courage and that sense of kind of ego inflation, and suddenly you care less about how you're dancing and how you're looking, and are able to flirt more with somebody that you might find attractive, which might be very difficult to do as a sober, you know, when you're sober, sorry, I'm getting a little bit lost now, but yeah, bringing it back to this question of genetic predisposition, there's also some very good evidence around twin studies looking at genetic predisposition, and it's a bit of a kind of lottery, though, in terms of two parents. Even if both the parents are addicts in recovery and they have children, they may find that at least one of their children will go on to develop an addiction, but some of the, if they have 2 or 3 other children, those other children might not develop an addiction, and they've had exactly the same parenting. Both of their parents have been in recovery. So it's far from a clear-cut picture. We're obviously learning so much more about neuroscience and about how genes operate year by year at the moment. So maybe one day science will be able to give us a clearer picture of what's going on. As an addiction therapist, I can tell you though that often the people I work with, when we start looking at their family trees, they will identify that maybe if not their parents' generation, then certainly their grandparents or their great-great-grandparents' generation will have had addiction there. What can we do about teenage drug use if we ban... Sorry, I didn't understand the second part of that question. If we ban drugs, how I'll respond to that, but tell me if I'm wrong, Penny. Oh, right, yes, okay, yes, I see what you mean, thank you. I thought you were talking about if we as a society ban drugs. Of course, parents, one of the built-in challenges of being a parent is that your child is growing up and is constantly seeking more autonomy, and especially through the teenage years is becoming less and less under your immediate control as they go out into the world and start building their own personalities and their own identities. Of course, you as a parent can't watch over them 24/7, nor would it be healthy to do so. But what you can do as a parent is have very clear boundaries around what is acceptable behaviour whilst living under your roof. You can set a very clear rule that drug use is not acceptable. And when I say drug use, I also include alcohol. In the United Kingdom, we have quite a lax attitude to teenage binge drinking, and parents often follow what my own father did, the kind of French model, as my father called it, of thinking it's a good idea to introduce teenagers to drinking within the family. I would suggest that actually the United States has a far better attitude to alcohol, because the United States attitude to alcohol is very much based on the idea that the human brain is still developing until the mid-20s, and the later that you can hold off alcohol use, the better in terms of brain development. Even low levels of alcohol use can have a lasting impact on a teenager's brain. So it's far better actually to completely steer the young person away from alcohol use till the legal age of using it in the UK, if not the age that they have in America, which is 21. I think that we are going through a process in the United Kingdom of understanding that we have a very harmful relationship with alcohol, a very kind of long embedded cultural relationship with alcohol. But actually, if you can delay the use of alcohol into the late teens, if not early 20s, you actually will reduce the amount of alcoholic dependent drinking by adults, because the impact of alcohol on the teenage brain is being well documented now, and we know that those young people who are exposed to teenage binge drinking have a far greater likelihood of going on to develop alcohol dependency as adults. Bringing it back to your question, Penny, I think that within the family, these rules that you have around what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, have to be firmly enforced and have to be backed up with real action. It's all very well saying we will not allow you to smoke cannabis in the home, and that we do not believe that smoking cannabis is a good idea. Those are fine words, but they need to be backed up with action. I think it's important to educate yourselves as parents and also educate young people about the kind of cannabis that is now available on the streets. Many parents that I meet and work with, unfortunately, have a very outdated view of cannabis. They think it's just a harmless soft drug because they remember smoking, maybe a few puffs, maybe smoking regularly when they're at university, and remember it being quite a benign soft drug that just resulted in, fits of the giggles and the munchies. Well, that is a cannabis that is no longer sold on the streets in England, or actually pretty much certainly not in America. What's happened with cannabis is that in the last 20 years, cannabis has been selectively bred, genetically modified. The seeds have been genetically modified by intensive breeding programs, and very much bred to increase the percentage of THC, the active ingredient that creates the high. And this has happened to the detriment of the CBD, which is the other active substance. And the CBD is known to have antipsychotic qualities. The CBD is known to kind of offset some of the more dangerous aspects of THC. But unfortunately, the plant has been very much bred for THC content. And so it's completely different as an experience to the drug that many parents have tried or many grandparents have tried. And it's no longer a soft drug. It's a very powerful drug, which needs to be treated with respect by adults. Even adults who've had a long history of smoking cannabis need to treat this drug with respect. And teenagers absolutely need to avoid this substance. We have a growing evidence base about the relationship between the stronger strains of cannabis and mental health problems in teenagers. And one of the saddest things about my job as an addiction expert has been seeing the impact of cannabis on teenagers, and sometimes seeing irreversible damage that has been done to teenagers' brains. We hope that as the education message gets out there, that cannabis can do this to young people, that parents will start treating this drug as a lot more of a serious threat to young people's mental health. But we are far from a place where parents realise what they're dealing with, and that's one of my real hopes about being involved with this blog, letting the light in, that it will educate parents that cannabis is a serious drug. It's kind of like the Incredible Hulk of cannabis now, compared to the drug that it used to be. Does that answer that question, Penny? Yes, I do. The question is, do you think schools should be more aware of the connection between stress and drug use? Yes. One of my most interesting times as an addiction therapist was when I was working for a charity called Involve, and I was working as an addiction therapist in schools. Thank you. I was working as an addiction therapist in schools. And one thing that became clear to me is, first of all, the delivery of counselling in schools is very patchy. Even in private schools where there are definitely the financial resources, having qualified addiction therapists as part of the team is really not something that happens very commonly, even though often the problems that schools are experiencing, be it through eating disorders, self-harm, misuse of substances, and in those substances I include nicotine. One thing that became very clear to me as an addiction therapist in schools is that adults don't tend to think about nicotine seriously or see it through the young person's eyes, but often nicotine is the first drug that a young person might become actively addicted to. And actually there are severe consequences for misusing that drug in school, not least the fact that if you are addicted to nicotine and you're at school, it can really get in the way of your schooling, because you will be craving a cigarette and thinking about going off and smoking in the break rather than concentrating on your studies. But of course schools take nicotine very seriously as well, and often will suspend a young person if they're caught smoking, especially if it's more than once. And come down very heavily. I think we also do really need to recognise that young people in the UK and in many countries around the world are under a ridiculous and intolerable amount of pressure these days to perform academically, especially with the kind of wider economic issues that we've got going on in the world, where there's enormous pressure and there's a sense that the world is not going to deliver to young people the kind of things that it delivered to the parents' generation. It's become a lot tougher to get on the housing ladder, to get a good job, even if you have a degree, or even if you've got a postgraduate degree and a higher degree. It can still be very difficult to get a good job. And so young people from an early age are displaying symptoms of depression and stress. And schools need to be aware of this, because schools have really bought into this kind of academic performance competition that, and I'm not completely dismissing that as a good idea in terms of raising the standards of education. That's been a good thing, and helping parents to understand which schools are performing in their local area and which ones aren't. But we also need to realise the impact of that kind of thinking on young people, and the kind of stress that places on young people, and have some sensitivity to that. And also have some sensitivity to the fact that if a young people is using an illegal substance, especially, or if a young person is doing things which are starting to harm themselves and impact on other people, quite often schools start to take action when a young people's behaviour starts impacting on the other people in the peer group. It's not just a question of being a bad child or somebody being a rebel. There are usually some quite big things happening at home, especially, or in the child's kind of life that the parents may not know about, which are responsible. And the other thing which I think it's really important for parents and teachers and anybody who's involved in looking after young people to think about is the fact that we live in a world now which is completely different to the world that older people grew up in. My generation was the last generation of people to go through school and university without the internet. And without the brilliant things that the internet brings, but also the very serious things that the internet brings for young people in terms of cyberbullying, in terms of not being able to switch off from contact with other people, in terms of the kind of pressure to always look good, to always be on, to always be kind of Instagram ready or Facebook Live ready, to kind of have a life that's living up to the comparison, not just with your local peer group, but with the global population. These are enormous pressures that older people have no idea about, and they are impacting on young people. And we do need to be aware about that. And we need to be aware that we don't understand what it's like to be a young person today. One thing as an addiction therapist that I see, which again is something which is completely new, and we haven't got an evidence base about it because we've got the first generation growing up with this, access to pornography on the internet from a young age. And all young people are seeing pornography from a young age now. Now we've got smartphones. Pornography is being played in the playground, and it's shaping young people's attitude to their bodies. It's shaping young people's attitude to their own sexuality and to what sex is. We have this culture where sending sexually explicit pictures is being completely normalized amongst young people. These are pressures and dangers which are completely new. And we've created this incredible technology, but we haven't thought through the impact of that on young people. We haven't got the guidelines in place. We haven't got the infrastructure in place to protect young people. Parents worry about their teenager rejecting them if they're too strict around drugs and alcohol. Yes, they do. I think it's inevitable that you are going to come into conflict with a young person if you set firm boundaries, especially if your young person is in a peer group where other parents are not setting such firm boundaries. And so perhaps one of the first things that it would be good to do would be to network with the other parents. Often young people, especially a young person who, as I talked about earlier, a young person who has already developed an unhealthy relationship with a substance, one person in a peer group can really skew the whole peer group. And one person can kind of manipulate and control a peer group. So I think it's important for parents to take their power back and to network with other parents, and try not to be the only bad parent, or in fact you're actually being a good parent by setting firm boundaries. I think it's also important to remember that you are the parent. parents these days often want to be the child's friend, and that's great to have a friendly relationship, but at the end of the day, you are the parent, you're not the friend, and your job as a parent is to guide your young person and protect your young person from harm whilst you can. Whilst the young person is under your roof, you have the right to set those boundaries. Of course, once the young person is self-sufficient, then they can go off and they can do whatever they want. But you do not have to be complicit in enabling behaviour that you know is damaging. So that's a tough one. If you find it difficult to set boundaries, if you find that you have that sort of backlash, that emotional backlash of not finding it very easy to cope with, if the young person is saying they hate you, or you're horrible, or whatever the young person is saying to you, then I think it's really important to get support and to not be alone with this. There are some fantastic support groups out there for parents. Drug Fam springs immediately to mind. There's the Al-Anon Family Support Network, which is free, and that's available around the world. If you Google Al-Anon, AL-ANON, that's a family support structure for parents who, or for anybody who's struggling with a family member's addiction. There's the Frank website, which can steer you, www.talktofrank.com, which can steer you in the direction of local help and resources. Of course, there's your doctor. If you're feeling, one thing which we haven't had a chance to really go into today, and we've only got 4 minutes of this session left, which is probably a good thing because my throat's starting to get a little bit sore, is that parents and carers can be really affected by a young person's substance use and behaviour. When you read the Letting the Light In blog, which is a very kind of intimate account of how addiction has affected this particular parent, you will see that if you do not nip this in the bud, and if you do not take action in the early stages, then by the time a child has reached, if a child starts using cannabis at 13, by the time they've reached, 14 or 15, you may find somebody who's being very volatile, if not aggressive, in the home. And that can be very stressful for parents. I actually like working with parents as much as I do with the addict themselves, because parents can be really stressed. Parents can be struggling with depression themselves. Parents can have post-traumatic stress disorder from some of the things that they've experienced in their own home. And it's really important to prioritize looking after yourself as a parent or carer, because it's that thing that when you're in an airplane, they say to you, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before on your children. And that is so true. If you're not looking after yourself, if you're being depleted, and if you're being affected by the person you love's addiction, then you may find that you're just not able to go on, that you're the person who is in the greatest emotional pain. Remember that the person who's using the substances, they often don't even remember what happened, especially if somebody came home drunk and then was, sick all over the living room floor, or, punched the wall, or whatever the behaviour was. They may have no actual recollection of that event, but as the sober parent, you don't forget that. You may have, your young person may have said things to you which you can't unhear. And although you may say to yourself, well, this is just the alcohol talking, or this is just the drugs talking, you can't actually get those messages out of your head, and that's very traumatic. So please, any parents watching this, do prioritize looking after yourselves. Do try and go and see a therapist if you can. If you don't have the resources to go and see somebody like myself, then there are some free resources out there. You can always go and see your doctor in the UK for free. Be aware that often doctors don't know that much about addiction. We sadly are in a situation where still in universities teaching doctors, there is very little emphasis put on addiction, very little understanding of addiction. Still in the UK, we have a very outdated model of addiction, which is very much a physical dependency medical model of addiction. So seeing addiction in terms of whether the person is physically dependent and needs to be detoxed. Well, the detox side of addiction is the simplest part to manage. Even a heroin addict can be detoxed from heroin in 3 to 5 days on the whole, and then be completely drug free. So the physical dependency side is very simple. It's the mental and emotional and spiritual part of addiction that is the challenging part. And that's why you can find people who've given up cigarettes for 5 years who still really crave cigarettes, because that cigarette was part of their stress management strategy and they haven't come up with alternative methods of managing stress, so still are really craving. One other thing which I'd just like to say is that there are 12-step programs available out there for anybody struggling with an addiction. Alcohol, the 12-step program is Alcoholics Anonymous. Narcotics Anonymous is there for drug addiction. If you have codependency issues, which is issues with how you relate to yourself, looking after yourself, and caretaking other people is a common form of codependency. There's an organisation called CODA. So there are resources out there. We are coming to the end of our time here today. I hope it has been useful, and I know this will be available on Periscope for the next 24 hours. I'm not sure how things work on Facebook Live. I think it will be on my page for a while. We are going to be doing these sessions regularly. The author of the blog Letting the Light In and I are going to establish a regular routine for doing these sessions. Please, if it has been useful to you, share with friends, with colleagues. It's very much part of my ethos to give back to the world. I am so grateful for being in recovery today and for the fact that I had the resources to be able to afford some of the best treatment in the world. I'm very aware that most people don't have access to that, and I believe this is an addiction that affects people from every walk of life, and everybody should have the ability to get help for this illness. So this is one small way that I can help that. And there are lots of charities and resources out there. It's just a question of going out there and finding them. So thank you for joining us today, and until I see you the next time, goodbye. Bye.